So thanks very much, Barbara, and let me echo the gratitude to the organizers of this conference. As Barbara said, my focus is on public history and activism during the anti-apartheid struggle. So the principal focus of my presentation is on the intersection or relationship between public history and activism, with reference to South Africa in the 1970s and particularly the 1980s, 2 decades characterized by mounting opposition to the system of apartheid. First, I want to consider in very broad brushstrokes issues of definition about the above-mentioned relationship. Secondly, to make the rather obvious point that temporal and geographic context matter in understanding this relationship. Although not exceptional, South Africa in the 1980s provided a distinctive instance of the constitutive relationship between public history and activism. Finally, if time permits, I want to offer very brief reflections on the implications of this relationship for the discipline of history, and in particular for historians. Activism, in my mind, is the practice of direct action in pursuit of political and or social goals. Although apparently precise, this definition leaves open the important issue of what is meant by political and social goals. In other words, it could encompass the entire spectrum of politics, from radical and progressive to conservative and reactionary. My interest in this paper is on the former ensemble of ideas and practices, which in South Africa was framed as a struggle against apartheid and, more radically, against racial capitalism. It was imagined as integral to the broader struggle against colonialism. In this sense, therefore, activism is about challenging hegemonic systems, the ideologies, laws, policies, and practices of exploitation and oppression. More precisely, for the purposes of this presentation, it is counter-hegemonic. However, activism as an oppositional disposition is incomplete. In order to be meaningful, it must simultaneously be about alternative emancipatory imaginings and practices at various scales, from the personal or domestic to the global or universal. So what then about history and activism? One way of thinking about this question is to consider the 3 distinct but potentially interrelated propositions: history of activism, history for activism, and history as activism. The production of histories of resistance or activism may or may not be directly related to contemporary emancipatory movements. Such histories may be utilized by these movements independent of the researcher, scholar. In the second, history is deliberately, consciously produced and mobilized in support of activism. Thirdly, and this is really the key issue that I want to make, is that the production of history is itself, or can be, a form of activism. Public history, it could be argued, is able productively to blur, perhaps overcome, the distinction between these ideas about the relationship between history and activism. Certainly, I want to argue that this was evident in South Africa in the period under discussion. The 1970s and 1980s was characterized by mounting mass struggles against apartheid, led by numerous local and national movements. These counter-hegemonic movements were spaces of burgeoning radical ideas and practices, of critiques of apartheid and capitalism, experimenting with building democratic organizations, and mobilizing various repertoires of struggle. Millions were involved in numerous acts of protest that by the late 1980s had effectively crippled the apartheid system. Simultaneously, this was a period of profound transformation of the discipline of history that enabled the emergence of a movement of people's or popular history in the 1980s, which contained important practices that are the hallmarks of public history. It's impossible in this presentation to explain all the elements that contributed to this. So let me just say that the new or revisionist history from the 1970s in South Africa was profoundly influenced by social history, particularly emanating from the history workshop movement in the UK. as well as the new left politics that emerged from a critique of Stalinism in the 1960s, as well as the anti-colonial struggles and anti-war movements of the time. History from below, social history of workers, peasants, women, young people, but particularly of black people, became the central areas of focus of this new history. African history and oral history flourished. Black history is one covered to counter their erasure by the white racist regime. Pertinently, histories of black resistance were emphasized. These histories constituted the primary elements of what was called people's history, of alternative and counter-hegemonic narratives, which centered the experiences of the black majority, and especially the resistance against oppression. A number of initiatives were launched in this period to popularize this new radical history. And here I want to focus on some of the salient ways in which these histories engage various publics, on education in movements, on events called open days, and popularizing alternative histories. From the 1970s, there was a proliferation of local and national movements, in particular trade unions, student organizations, community movements, and women's movements. In these movements, political education became a crucial aspect of the creation of organizations and their counter-ideologies, in particular as a conscious effort to produce new and informed activists. History was absolutely central in this exercise, and knowledge of the past resistance in South Africa and other colonial contexts was deemed as an important marker, determinant of the quality of an activist. University scholars were regarded as the key sources of such knowledge, and an increasing number of them became involved in activist education, particularly in the trade unions, which occurred outside of the precincts of the university. These histories, coming out, particularly out of social history, were popularized as alternative history, which process was aided enormously by the burgeoning of an alternative press, which regularly published articles and supplements on, for example, African history and marking anniversaries of key moments in black resistance. One of the key issues that confronted academics was what to do with universities, even as they were producing new and radical histories. An important intervention that occurred in the 1980s was the organization of what was called Open Days. These were festivals of popular history linked to academic conferences, where various publics, especially activists from movements, were invited onto university campus, an entirely novel idea in South Africa in the 1980s. Open days consisted of seminars, plays, exhibitions, poetry, and music related to black histories and contemporary resistance. But I do want to say that not all academics supported these activities, as they were concerned about blurring the lines between academic conferences and public participation. From the 1980s, some historians also began to give attention to assisting communities to write their own histories. A book was published by the research entity of which I'm part called Write Your Own History. Academics became involved in training community historians, trade unionists, to assist them to produce their own histories. Central to this, of course, was the use of oral history. It's important also to acknowledge that universities only represented only one sphere of this popular and people's history. Outside and usually independent of the academy, there existed a long, albeit uneven tradition of liberation histories. From the early 1970s, there was a much more dynamic proliferation of this kind of history, particularly in the trade unions and in the black consciousness movement. These developments, this kind of burgeoning of people's history, was of course not peculiar or even distinctively South African. For example, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the US experienced quite significant growth of black history projects, including community museums, as African Americans sought to uncover and write their own histories, previously marginalized and erased. These were inextricably linked to the civil rights movement and the radicalization thereof from the mid-1960s. So let me, in the 3.5 minutes I have, I'm super on time, which is kind of unusual. Let me offer some final reflections. Okay? The knowledge of history became an important part in the making of an anti-apartheid activist. In that sense, public history, this kind of turn to various publics, was instrumental in the making of the anti-apartheid movement. Academic historians became a new breed of public intellectuals, active in the public sphere as critics of the system and producers of counter-hegemonic knowledge. The turn to the public also implied a potential recalibration of the relationship between the academy and activist emancipatories, and ask questions about the role of universities in the public and particularly in emancipatory movements. An important consequence was the unprecedented popularizing of the discipline at all levels of formal education. In the 1980s, history became undoubtedly the most popular subject at universities. Hundreds of students turned up for undergraduate and postgraduate students. Yet, and I do want to end on some critical reflections, the engagements with the debates on the meanings and practices of public history remained utterly undeveloped in the 1980s in South Africa. Among some, there was even a reluctance to call the aforementioned practices public history, because doing so, they believed, implied working with, not against, the white minority state. In this sense, there was a problematic conflation with the state and public. There was also no engagement with the growing, albeit still peripheral, critique of what Raphael Samuel referred to as academic history's very hierarchical view of the constitution of knowledge. In the main, academic historians were still perceived as the authoritative producers of historical knowledge, whose work should then be popularized and disseminated. And there was a significant debate in South Africa about what it meant to popularize. One of the criticisms among some academics, this constituted the dumbing down of history. The politics of co-producing histories were not yet sources of debate and contention in the academy. And there was very limited attention given to archives, never mind a critique of archives as principally the sphere of preservation, and not yet a conversation about the reconfiguration of archives into activist archives. These questions and debates only began to animate the discipline of history in the post-1994 period, in the democratic era. It was then that the relationship between public history and activism was reimagined, and new ideas that informed debates internationally amongst public historians began to influence discussions in South Africa. Thank you.